Welcome to Press Play, Media Strategies from Scot Media Tulsa. This is the podcast where we dive deep into the world of marketing, communications, and public relations. I'm your host, Jeremy Scott, and today we're going to be looking into what you can do as a PR or media relations pro when the news says no. How can you still get your idea covered? And more importantly, what do you tell your client? We'll discuss, and I'll share a special interview with a marketing pro. That's all ahead on this episode of Press Play. Well, I am so excited to be back for week 2 of my new podcast, and I want to thank everybody who listened to the first week. I got a lot of positive feedback, some great comments from friends, people in my network, some folks I haven't spoken to in a long time who reached out, said they loved the idea, and it was super encouraging, so I'm glad to be back for week 2. And this week I'm talking about how to handle when the news says no. So as I mentioned in my first week, I'm kind of basing this podcast off of the metrics that come from my blog. So I have a blog on my website, scotmediatulsa.com, where you can go and read my blogs on a number of topics. And then I'm looking at which ones are getting the most click-through, the most engagement, and the most shares on social media, including my LinkedIn site. And this was the second one. So it was one that resonated with people. It's something that happens a lot. If you work in PR or media relations, obviously you're used to hearing the word no. As a journalist myself and someone who works in media, I'm used to saying no. And oftentimes that can be the end of the conversation. But there is a next step when you work in media relations or PR. How do you handle it when someone says no to you? And more importantly, what do you tell your clients? So your clients don't like to hear no. And what can you as the PR professional tell them to make them understand that you're still working on it? It's not the end of the road, and there are still options ahead. I mentioned at the top of the show that I'd be sharing part of an interview I did with a good friend of mine who works as a marketing professional on the East Coast, and she has some pretty interesting things to say about one of the topics that I'll get to here in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about immediately what you should do when you hear no. And you're representing a client, the media says we can't do it for any number of reasons. It could be that we don't think it's a good story idea. Now is not the right time. But the first thing that you have to do, as I mentioned in the blog, is acknowledge the rejection with positivity. So as the PR person who's representing a client, it's really important that you're transparent with your client, but you have to maintain a positive tone. So keep that positive energy up. Let them know that you're still working on this, that, while the news may not have picked it up this time, that doesn't mean that it's not valuable. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that you can't try again in the future. By acknowledging the rejection without dwelling on it, you show the client that it's a normal part of the process and there are still opportunities to explore. Seriously, I can't stress that enough. Saying no or hearing no is part of the process. It happens all the time. Your clients are not going to be used to that, especially when they're hiring you. They're going to say, well, what am I paying you for? Well, you're paying the PR person to be the connection. But if you're looking for guaranteed media, that's an ad, and they're not buying ads. They're hiring you to get earned media, and there's a huge difference there. With earned media, no is regularly part of the game. It's also important to offer a constructive perspective. So media outlets have very limited bandwidth. Many newspapers and TV stations are cutting staff while they're still expected to do the same amount of work, or maybe even sometimes more work. So they have a lot to deal with. Their focus can shift very quickly depending on staffing levels, depending on who called in sick that day, depending on current events. I have a whole other blog about the wrong time to pitch a news story, and it seems like media professionals seem to pitch ideas during the biggest breaking news events. So when you get a no, it's important to explain the perspective to your client with clarity. Let them know that rejection is the name of the game, that it has nothing to do with the quality of the story. It could be due to timing. It could be due to breaking news. Totally other factors beyond your control. Remind your client that you can try to pitch it again at a more appropriate time. Another thing you can do is refine the angle and pitch it again. So sometimes a slight change in the angle can make a huge difference. So based off of feedback that you might get from a newsroom or a journalist, if you have a good relationship with them, you can work with your client to come up with ways to tweak the angle or bring in some more localized content or a timely element work with your client to refine the story, and then pitch it again in a week or two. It's important not to turn around and pitch it the next day or even really the next week. I would recommend a couple of weeks. It shows your client that you're committed to getting the story out there. It gives you as the PR person more time to work on it, and it lets the journalists know that you respect their time and you understand now's not a great time. We'll do it in the future. This is also a great time for you to sit back and work with your client to understand that while the traditional media may say no, you could think smaller and maybe a little bit more targeted. So instead of pitching to a TV station that represents a huge area, a huge DMA, and a large audience, instead pitch to blogs, trade publications, or local small town newspapers or media outlets that can lead to great exposure. By diversifying your media outreach, you can often secure coverage in places that directly reach your client's audience, maybe more so in a way that you might think with a traditional TV or a newspaper audience. It's also something you can do. This is something I recommend a lot that PR people generally don't seem to think about, is you can create your own media coverage on leveraged owned media channels. So what does that mean? So if you're working with a client that's a business or a company, they're likely going to have their own social media pages, their own blogs, they're going to have newsletters. There are a lot of ways there that you can use their own owned media where you have full control. So what that means is if you want to say yes to that, then the answer is yes. You have control of that. So work with them on producing stories that you can write yourself, or interview people in the company to create articles that can be posted on social media. You can shoot video yourself with interviews to produce up something for social media for the website, or you can hire a company. I do that, so that's a good option if you're looking for that, is to hire somebody with video production and storytelling experience to come in and work with your client to come up with some content that's engaging. Offering this alternate route can really help the client tap into social media and digital platforms where their audience is already spending time. These are people who already support them. They like those pages. They know what this is. It's going to be a great way to work with them. Here's an option that I never thought I would say, and this is where I'm going to bring in a good friend of mine. Pitch to influencers and content creators. As someone who's a kind of an old school journalist, the new age of influencers and online content creators is very forward thinking, but you can't deny that these people in their jobs as content creators have millions or hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands of followers in your community. So if you're looking for a way to maximize coverage or get a story out there, get a feature out there, or get some promotion, going with influencers is a great option. I recently had the chance to sit down with a good friend of mine, Alex Page Hatley, who is the Senior Director of Marketing at the Bushnell Performing Arts Center, which is located in Hartford, Connecticut. We were talking about outside the box ways she and her team get coverage, whether it's media coverage or in this case, just promotion for their center and their shows. And she spoke a little bit about partnering with social media influencers, including why they specifically don't target those with millions of followers. So here's part of that conversation. How do you approach influencers? How do you find them? And then you don't have to give specifics, of course, but I assume you pay them or work with them, or is there an agreement, or just kind of walk through that? How does that work?
Yeah, it really depends, influencer to influencer. The first year was really hard because we had to do a lot of that outreach ourselves. We had to kind of look and see regionally who were local influencers who had, you don't necessarily want the influencer who has 1 million followers, because who knows how many of those are local to you. We were trying to find the hyper local influencers who maybe had the sweet spot of 10 to 15,000 followers, and they did Connecticut restaurants or something, or they lived in Hartford. And we would reach out, and initially I was just trading tickets, hey, you can have 2 tickets to the show and 2 tickets to give away to your audience, if you would come and post about the experience. As we kind of grow and evolve in this area, and as some of our partner influencers get more and more larger audiences, we have started to say well, what do you want? And we kind of put it on them to give us a price. And we've seen anything from $250 for a story or a reel from the night to $1,000, and I think that is kind of pricey because tickets themselves are $120 each. So if you think of it that way, the $250 plus we're giving you 4 tickets is that's quite a nice package. So we will usually back away or just say like, no, thank you if it's up to that price. But I think anywhere in like the 250 to like 750 range is something that, we're happy to pay. We're happy to support content creators that way. And I think it's just about, finding the right partners who, are meeting your goals. Like if like our goal to find and attract new audiences and younger audiences. That's why we're not reaching out to traditionally like performing arts influencers, because I think they're probably already aware of us and already familiar with us. So it is finding the right partners. It's just doing the outreach and being respectful of not putting too much on them, because if it's going to feel too much like a sales pitch, it needs to feel like their content. So we don't put any rules or stipulations. We just say, hopefully you won't post negative things, but just post about your experience in your own words.
So it's kind of like earned media in the sense of, you can give them the idea, but it's up to the TV station, it's up to the producer, it's up to the reporter to do it their own way. So you kind of treat them like they're reporters. Yeah. Interesting. Do you find, because that's very forward thinking, and I think as digital takes over and the media landscape changes, as media relations changes, you have to be thinking forward. Do you, in your role, run into some pushback from your internal folks at the Bushnell who are like, well, we really need to be going toward this way, or maybe an older generation who doesn't quite understand that? I mean, if you can just talk a little bit about that dynamic and how you convince someone who maybe isn't like sold on the idea that investing in an influencer relationship or any sort of modern marketing is worth it.
At least at my organization, it's not really a hard sell. Because those traditional media that we were buying and we were investing in, maybe even as recently as like 5 or 6 years ago, like print, our readership of print has like nosedived, at least in Hartford. So, that's not something where we spend so much of our money anymore. Like there is still a good chunk that get the newspaper, and we strategically buy on like maybe Thursdays where there's the arts column, and then Sundays a lot of people get the Sunday paper. So we're more strategic there. Radio is a tough sell. I think that the fact that having influencers and having it in the digital space that's so measurable, like they can give me a report the day, the week after their engagement with us, that shows exactly how many views they got, how many people were engaged, how many people signed up for the promo for giveaway tickets. And that is really tactile, great information to bring back to people who might be resistant. Because if you're seeing a print ad, like you cannot tell me how many people bought because they saw that ad. And no disrespect to like the top of the funnel tactics, like those awareness tactics are important, and you need that. But there are so many different ways to have such higher reach these days, like even if that's OTT or if that's like streaming radio or podcast, like you can have the numbers that support who's seeing it.
Yeah, and I love that you brought it back to metrics, because isn't that totally what everybody wants to see? They want to see the results. They want to see the numbers. That's something I'd never even thought about, is how quickly you can get those results back. So yeah, good insight there. Alex Paige Hatley, I know you're a busy lady. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great talking to you, and I can't wait to talk to you more in the future. You're the best.
You're the best.
Yeah, really good insight there from Alex, and seriously, thanks again for coming on. It's a topic that I haven't really talked that much about before, partnering with influencers, but it really can be a way to help your client get their message out there when the news says no. And then the final thing I'll mention as we wrap it up on how to handle that with your client is it's important to offer a timeline for the future. So again, as I've said, PR is a long game. It helps to remind clients of this. As someone who worked in news for years, left to do communications in a corporate setting, I was warned by a lot of people that you might come off as pushy, or you might come off as too immediate because you're used to working in such a fast-paced environment. And I think your clients are used to that too. People who work at the upper levels of corporate, or have meeting after meeting after meeting. I mean, these are people who are used to getting results instantly, and it's important to remind them, again, PR is a long game. Set the expectation that it may take time to land the right story at the right time, and that's important to land the right story at the right time. There's so many factors that play into why the news may skip on your story this time, but they might pick it up again in a couple of weeks. Remind your clients of that. It reassures them that you are playing the long game, that rejection is a temporary setback, but that you're there to represent them and get their message out there in unique and interesting ways. So that'll wrap it up on this episode of Press Play. If you're interested in more topics like this, again, I have my blog at scotmediatulsa.com. That's SCOT, scotmediatulsa.com. There's a whole section on blogs. I have dozens of them on various topics. We'll be talking about another one this time next week. For Press Play, I'm your host, Jeremy Scott, and we'll see you next time.